I wanted to rise in strong support for the Conyers Amendment and go back to something that Ms. Lofgren was talking about in terms of the root causes of why kids and people are coming across the border, and specifically wanted to talk about sexual and gender-based violence in these countries, because I think that we really have to focus on what the situation is and why kids are coming across the border. And I would like to ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to introduce into the record the Kids in Need of Defense report called Neither Security Nor Justice.
Objection will be made a part of the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I quote from this report about the lack of protection and services for victims of gang-related sexual violence and gender-based violence. And this is from a police officer in El Salvador. He says, "There are no viable options in this country for victims of gang violence. If you report, the gang will come after you and the state can't protect you. Even if the gang member goes to jail, there's a network in place to harm you." Mr. Chairman, in Central America, the Northern Triangle countries are among the top 5 countries in the world with the worst female homicide rates. If you go to Honduras, from 2005 to 2012, murders of Honduran women and girls increased 346%. In El Salvador, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies found that El Salvador had the highest rate of femicide, or gender-motivated killing of women, in the world. In 2012 alone, groups reported that 731 Guatemalan women and girls were murdered, and only 2% of those murdered were investigated. Violence against women rose 17% in 2013. In El Salvador, there were organized armed criminal actors targeting women and girls, using rape as an intimidation tactic in communities. And from 2010 to 2012, an average of 461 rapes per year, Mr. Chairman, 461 rapes per year reported. I think this is really important because we are talking about why kids are coming across the border. Why do parents send their children unaccompanied through the dangers that you rightly pointed out of getting to the United States? Because there are no other options. It's not because they're just sending kids over for the heck of it, because the United States is a great country. Of course we're a great country, but you don't send your kids through that kind of trauma, separation, and danger unless there is a real need. And the specific angle of sexual and gender-based violence has to be considered in this context. And Mr. Conyers' amendment, I think, gets at that and assures that we are looking at these situations, assessing them, and really making a determination that should be made in order to provide for due process, but more importantly, in order to preserve the tradition that this country has of being a place of refuge and a place of protection for people who are seeking that kind of asylum. So I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we will accept Mr. Conyers' amendment and that we continue to think about and articulate not some false facts about why people are coming here and what would cause a mom to send her kid here, or what would cause a child to decide to come here on their own, but in fact look at the circumstances in these countries. And I also just wanted to say thank you to my colleague from Louisiana for an incredibly articulate, personal perspective that about the problems with comparing what is happening in our cities to what is happening in these countries. I just think that comparison is harmful, it's detrimental, and it's I think it's actually not accurate at all. Basically, what this amendment is saying is we don't want to hold, and right now the bill says up to 14 days. That's a long time for a child to be held by immigration, Homeland Security, who aren't trained and who aren't prepared with the resources that they need to have in order to take care of kids. And we just have to recognize that this is about children. That's what we're talking about. We're specifically talking about kids. And so what we're saying is that within 72 hours, my amendment would say that within 72 hours, they would get transferred to people who actually know how to work with kids or trained to work with kids, and they would be able to have a place where If it does take more than 72 hours, less than 14 days, more than 14 days, that they would have the proper care that they need. That does not seem unreasonable to me, and I recognize that I am somebody who's worked on immigration for a long time. I've been to the facilities at the border. I've been with kids who have been in this situation, and really it's unconscionable that we would treat them like adults. We really need to differentiate and recognize that they're children. The practical effect is that we actually maintain our status quo and that we make sure that kids do get transferred over within 72 hours to people who can look after them. That's really the practical effect, is kids will get the care that kids deserve. I would really have to ask the majority why they would be proposing this bill and this change, because to me, it doesn't have a rationale other than that this would wrap immigrant kids up into the same rhetoric of how immigrants in general are being described, which I also don't agree with, that they're somehow criminals and dangerous. These are kids we're talking about, kids who are coming across seeking asylum, seeking safety, and we should recognize that they need to be treated, everybody needs to be treated with respect, but certainly the most vulnerable. You have raised several times that we should not put the burden of the costs on the taxpayer and the deep concern for taxpayers, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with the concern for taxpayers, but if we're really concerned about taxpayers, then number one, we should pass comprehensive immigration reform because it would bring $1.5 trillion into the economy. Number two, I'm on the budget committee and we had 3 economists come and testify. 2 of them were majority witnesses. One runs a conservative think tank. And when I asked him about immigration and specifically mass deportation, increased detention, all of these bills that we've been voting on without a hearing in this committee, what he said is, they published a report, and I don't have it in front of me, but maybe we can pull it up. They published a report saying that that would be a tremendous cost to the country, and that it was fiscally irresponsible to move in that direction. And so I don't understand why we're suddenly talking about taxpayer burden, because if we're really concerned about taxpayer burden, we would actually move in a different direction. We would have real hearings about the issues of our broken immigration system, something that there has been bipartisan agreement on for so long. And yet in this committee, and I'm on the Immigration Border Security Subcommittee because I thought maybe we would engage with some of those critical questions. But in this committee, we have not had hearings on any of these things. So people are voting on these bills, some new members. I'm lucky to have worked on this issue before. I know a lot about it. But we should be talking about real solutions. This bill is not one of those real solutions. If enacted, this bill would result in more deportations, more returns, and less immigrants entering the country. And maybe there are some people on the other side of the aisle who would applaud that for reducing immigrant entries, but this bill fundamentally harms the health, safety, and well-being of children. Let's just be very clear about that. And when it was said earlier by one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in this committee that a nation's culture resides in the heart and soul of its people, I have to ask, what exactly are we saying with that comment? Are we saying that other cultures somehow don't have heart and soul, and that's why we're trying to pass these bills to keep immigrants out? Are we saying that somehow our heart and soul in America is so great that we're not going to provide for an attorney for children who are in need, or that we're not going to detain children for more than 72 hours? What is so great about the heart and soul of the American people if we do those things? And by the way, did we forget that the heart and soul of American people was actually brought over by immigrants unwilling and willing on slave ships, and unless you were Native American, that the heart and soul actually did a lot to build this country of other cultures. So I fundamentally don't understand why we would put this bill forward, why we would make arguments that somehow this is benefiting the taxpayer to not provide legal counsel. And I want to rise in support, strong support of Mr. Johnson's amendment, because it would bring some small amount of justice to a terribly unjust bill. I mean, really the idea that we would allow children, some of them toddlers, to appear alone in court is unfathomable to me. We know that our system works better and that we're better as a country when we make sure that everyone has access to a qualified attorney to help them navigate the system. And there's statistics around access to counsel. Among children with legal representation, 95.4% appeared for their court hearings. So even if you didn't care about the morality, you could talk about if the point is that we want kids to appear, then we should provide them with legal representation. And it would streamline the courts. But what we know is that today, 88% of the 3,200 children that have been ordered removed from July to December of 2014 didn't have an attorney. So we have a lot of work to do, Mr. Chairman, on how we actually respond to the issues. And quite frankly, we talk about civility, and I just have to say that increasingly the idea that immigrants somehow are a detriment to this country is so unjust and unfair to our history, to our values, and yes, to the heart and soul of who we are as Americans. I yield back. When American standards erode, refugees face greater risks everywhere. And the letter went on to say that, in fact, what Congress should do is eliminate many of the unjust barriers that deny or delay U.S. protection to legitimate refugees. And actually, it went on to talk about the need to pass comprehensive immigration reform. In addition, at the end of 2015, 20 national security leaders, including both Republicans and Democrats, including Henry Kissinger, General Petraeus, and others, said this. They said, "We must remain vigilant to keep our nation safe from terrorists, whether foreign or homegrown, and from violence in all its forms. At the same time, we must remain true to our values. These are not mutually exclusive goals. In fact, resettlement initiatives help advance U.S. national security interests by supporting the stability of our allies and partners that are struggling to host large numbers of refugees." Mr. Chairman, my state, the state of Washington, first started admitting refugees when we had Governor Dan Evans, a Republican, a very good man who looked at the situation of the Vietnamese refugees at the time and created a place for those refugees to come. He was so moved by the terrible situation and the plight of those Vietnamese refugees. It's continued to be a home for refugees across the world. It's one of the top 10 states for refugee resettlement. So I'm not necessarily worried that in my home state we would find support for banning refugees, but I think that to leave an issue of this consequence that has this level of magnitude for the United States' reputation in the world and for our national security interests would be foolhardy. And I don't think that we would take other great national security interests that we have and say to the American public, okay, we're going to leave this to you. I think we would keep that jurisdictional responsibility as Congress. And so I don't really understand why we would take any kind of a vote to allow the public to ban refugees from their communities when we know that generals, national security experts across the country have said that in order for us to be able to do what we do in other parts of the world, we need to be able to provide protection to refugees in those countries. And in fact, in Washington State, in Seattle, we settled some of the first Iraqi refugees who were translators for U.S. military forces in Iraq. And I remember meeting with one of them. He had lost one of his limbs because a device exploded and he was caught in the middle of it. And had he stayed in Iraq, he would have faced tremendous persecution because he was actually helping U.S. forces. So this has enormous implications, our policy around refugees, moral implications that have been spoken to so eloquently here, but also national security implications. And I would urge us to not give in to some desire to stir xenophobic attitudes in certain places across the country or use this for political gain, but instead to think about what is in the best interest of our national security and what upholds the values that have been so core and so critical to America as a shining light in the rest of the world. And I hope that we'll reject this amendment. Thank you, Mr.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I do.